In 1492, a man walked into the most sacred building in the Western world, dressed in the robes of God's representative on earth, and publicly baptized the children he wasn't supposed to have. His name was Rodrigo Borgia. He was the Pope, and nobody said a single word. Let's go back to the beginning, because the way this man came to power tells you everything about what he was willing to do once he had it. Rodrigo Borgia was born in Spain in 1431 into a family that had already figured out something most people never learn. The church wasn't a spiritual institution. It was the most powerful political machine in the world. And if you were smart enough and ruthless enough to treat it like one, you could take everything it had to offer, all the way to the top, all the way to Rome. By 25, Rodrigo was already a cardinal. That should have alarmed people. Cardinals were supposed to be seasoned men of faith. Rodrigo was a 25-year-old nephew of the current pope. That's not faith, that's nepotism wearing vestments. But nobody said anything, because in this world, saying things about the wrong people had consequences that tended to be permanent. So he climbed, for 40 decades, quietly and deliberately, accumulating wealth, accumulating allies, and accumulating something worth far more than either: other people's secrets. The kind of secrets that wrap around a man's neck like a leash and never let go. By the time the old pope died in 1492, Rodrigo Borgia had enough of those leashes to walk into that locked room of cardinals and pull every single one. What happened in that room was the most expensive election fraud in human history. Gold changed hands, staggering amounts, moved quickly and efficiently, with the ease of a man who had been buying things his entire life and knew exactly what everything cost. Promises were made, and where promises weren't enough, there were brief private conversations that left men looking different when they walked away. Quieter, more careful, more aware of exactly how much this particular man knew about them. When the votes were counted, Rodrigo Borgia was Pope Alexander VI. One elderly cardinal looked up at the ceiling when the announcement came. Then he said, quietly, to no one in particular, "God forgive us all." And he walked out, and he never spoke of it again, because that was the first rule of surviving the Borgia era. You saw what you saw, and you kept it behind your face. Now here is where Rodrigo Borgia separates himself from every other corrupt pope in history. The church had seen corrupt men before, men who took bribes, slept with women, played politics instead of praying. This wasn't new. What was new was that Rodrigo didn't hide any of it. He had children, multiple children, by women he wasn't married to, because of course he wasn't married, he was the pope. Celibacy was the entire foundation of his office. And his children weren't a whispered rumor, they were known, by name, by everyone. Cesare, Juan, Lucrezia, Joffrey, the Borgia children. Everybody knew exactly whose children they were, and everybody, kings, cardinals, ambassadors, ordinary people in the streets of Rome, simply lived with that knowledge, because what else were you going to do? You did not tell this pope he was wrong, not if you wanted to keep living the life you were currently living. So Europe watched and said nothing, and waited to see what he would do next. What he did next was announce the baptism. The news moved through the Vatican corridors on a Tuesday morning, carried by servants who kept their faces completely blank as they delivered it, because the ability to carry explosive information without reacting to it was a survival skill in this building. By the time it reached the senior clergy, the Vatican had gone very quiet. Pope Alexander VI was going to hold a public baptism inside the Vatican for his illegitimate children. He was going to stand in the holiest building in the Catholic world in his full papal robes and bless his own bastard children with holy water and call it a sacrament. A bishop found another bishop in a corridor, grabbed him by the arm, pulled him into a doorway and whispered, "Has he completely lost his mind?" The other bishop checked left, checked right, listened for footsteps. He has no mind left to lose. And then they both separated and walked in opposite directions, because somewhere down the corridor a door had opened. And in this building, in this era, being overheard was not a risk you took twice. The morning before the ceremony, Rodrigo was in his private chambers. His secretaries had learned that his mornings followed a pattern. He rose late, ate enormously, real food, the kind of meal that reminded you that under all the robes and ceremony there was a large physical man with large physical appetites. And he conducted business while eating, documents reviewed, kingdoms shaped, all of it happening around a table covered in food, with grease on his fingers and absolute authority in his eyes. His secretary read through the guest list. For each name, Rodrigo responded, a nod, a wave. Then the secretary said, "The Cardinal of San Marco." Rodrigo's hand paused for just a fraction of a second, then it kept moving. "Invite him, front row." The secretary hesitated, which in this job meant something was serious enough to risk the consequences of a pause. "Your Holiness, the cardinal has been writing letters to other cardinals, speaking against certain matters. We have read the correspondence." Rodrigo put a piece of meat in his mouth, chewed slowly, swallowed, didn't look up. "Invite him, front row." The secretary wrote it down, asked nothing else. This was the thing about Rodrigo Borgia. He didn't always reach for the sword. Sometimes, and these were the moments that frightened people most, he reached for something subtler. He put his enemies in the front row. He made them watch. He made them be present, visible, smiling at something they despised, in public, with witnesses. And every few minutes, his eyes would find them in the crowd to make absolutely sure they understood why they were there. The message, delivered without a single word: "I know what you've been doing. I've always known, and here you sit, because I put you here, and there is nothing you can do about that." Cruelty dressed as hospitality, which in Renaissance Rome was considered something of an art form. The Vatican was being decorated at a scale that made the staff uneasy in a way they couldn't quite name. Flowers by the cartload, white lilies and deep red roses, the Borgia colors, white and red, purity and blood pressed together, which if you looked at it long enough, started to feel less like decoration and more like a symbol of something you couldn't quite say out loud. Hundreds of candles placed and lit until the whole building smelled like a garden and glowed like a dream. Gold cloth draped over every surface. The servants worked in near silence, eyes down, faces blank. In this house, being noticed had costs. In a side chamber off the main hall, Lucretia Borgia was being prepared. 16 years old, already used as a political piece in 2 separate marriage negotiations, already trained at a cellular level to perform whatever this family needed her to perform. Her maids were braiding her hair with pearls. Her dress was pure white. She looked, to anyone who didn't know better, like exactly what the ceremony required, an innocent young woman receiving a holy sacrament. She had chosen every detail of that appearance deliberately. Her brother Cesare appeared in the doorway, 22 years old, already a cardinal, their father's arrangement of course, already possessed of that quality that made rooms go slightly quieter when he entered them. He looked at his sister across the room and said one thing: "Smile today." Lucretia didn't turn around. "I always smile." "Smile like you mean it. Father is watching everything." She turned then, looked at him with eyes that were much older than 16. "Father is always watching everything." Cesare held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded once and left. He had no answer to that, because it was simply, completely, permanently true. In this family, their father was always watching everything, and you adjusted accordingly, or you didn't, and the consequences were yours to live with, or not live with, depending. The guests arrived and were shown to their places, cardinals in scarlet, that particular red chosen by the church because it was the color of blood, meant to symbolize willingness to die for the faith, though looking around this room, the irony of that symbolism was difficult to miss. Nobles in silk, ambassadors from France, Spain, Milan, Venice, all of them here because refusing an invitation from this pope was not really an option. Every face wearing the same expression, carefully, professionally neutral. Not pleased, not disgusted, nothing. Because pleased looked sycophantic, and disgusted looked dangerous. And in a room controlled by Rodrigo Borgia, dangerous was not what you wanted to look. They waited. This was intentional. Rodrigo Borgia never entered a room on time. He entered a room when he chose to, always after everyone else was already in place, because the act of waiting for someone is itself a statement about the relationship between the person waiting and the person being waited for. Every minute those cardinals and nobles sat in those seats was another minute that quietly, unmistakably established who was in charge of this room. When he finally walked in, the room changed, large, broad, physically commanding in a way his ceremonial robes amplified rather than concealed. Papal white and gold, catching every flicker of candlelight and throwing it back. Moving slowly, with the particular unhurried quality of a man who had not been made to rush for anything in 30 years and did not intend to start now. And he was smiling. That smile. People who spent time at the Borgia court mentioned it in their letters and memoirs. Warm, generous, apparently delighted. The smile of a man surrounded by people he loved. It was remarkable. It was also, if you knew enough to look closely, completely and totally constructed, every degree of warmth placed there on purpose, a performance of humanity so polished it had become indistinguishable from the real thing, which, in its own way, was more unsettling than if he had simply walked in looking like what he was. The children were brought in. Small, white-dressed, impossibly young-looking in that enormous golden room full of powerful adults. They walked to the front. They stood before their father, and their father, the Pope, the Vicar of Christ, God's representative on earth, looked at them with something that, on any other face, you would have called love. Maybe it was. That is one of the most disturbing things about Rodrigo Borgia. He almost certainly did love his children, genuinely, in his way. The monster and the father coexisted in the same body without apparent conflict, which is so recognizably uncomfortably human that it almost makes it worse. The Cardinal of San Marco sat in the front row and did not move. A man in his 60s who had given his life to the church and had begun, carefully, privately, in letters he believed were secure, to say what was happening to it. He understood now, sitting in that seat, that nothing had been private, that Rodrigo had known for years and had been watching it develop the way a man watches a small fire from a safe distance, unhurried, certain he knows exactly when to put it out. And this ceremony, this public performance of illegitimate fatherhood inside the holiest walls in Christendom, this wasn't the punishment. This was just the message. The punishment, if it came, would come later, quietly, in some form he couldn't yet predict. That was how it worked with the Borgias. You rarely saw it coming. That was the point. The water poured from a golden vessel. The ancient words were spoken. The children were received into the church, formally, officially, in front of witnesses from every powerful nation in Europe, by their father, who was the Pope. The thing was done. There was no undoing it. It existed now, in the record, in the memory of every person in that room, in the letters that would be written that very evening by ambassadors to their kings. History had handed something it would not put down for 500 years. When it was finished, Rodrigo Borgia stood before the assembled hall and let the silence hold, the particular silence of something just completed that cannot be taken back. Then he smiled, and he said, in a voice that filled the entire space without him appearing to raise it at all, "God sees everything, and yet, here we all stand." Nobody laughed. Nobody responded. The candles flickered in a draught from nowhere visible, and every shadow in the room stretched and shifted for just a moment, and then settled back. That evening, the Cardinal of San Marco sent his servants away. He sat alone at his desk with a single candle, much smaller and more humble than the hundreds that had blazed in the Vatican that morning. And he wrote the longest letter of his life. His hand was steady. When you're writing something that might outlast you, your hand tends to be steady. He addressed it to a king. He described everything, the flowers, the guests, the children, the words the Pope had spoken at the end. He described the front row. He described the smile. And then, at the very bottom of the last page, he wrote one final sentence, not in formal language, but plainly, simply, the way you write something when you've stopped performing and are just telling the truth. This man will not stop until he has consumed everything. He sealed the letter, gave it to his most trusted courier, and watched from his window as the rider disappeared into the Roman evening. Then he sat back down, poured wine, and thought about all the other men who had written letters like this one, all the men who had sat in rooms like this one, after days like this one, and said among themselves that Rodrigo Borgia had gone too far. He thought about where those men were now. He poured more wine. At the Vatican, dinner was being served, a table that seemed to go on forever, covered end to end with food. The Borgia family sat together, Rodrigo at the head, Cesar to his right, Lucretia further down, young Joffre at the far end, still learning how to survive in this family without being consumed by it. A lute played somewhere behind a curtain. Rodrigo was laughing, not the public laugh, but a real one, deep and unguarded, the laugh of a man who had done exactly what he intended to do and feels exactly as he expected to feel. He lifted his cup. Today was a good day. Cesar looked at him from the right, quiet for a moment. Today was a bold day. They are not always the same. Rodrigo's laugh faded just slightly, just enough for Cesar to catch it, just enough for Lucrecia halfway down the table to catch it too. You worry too much. Someone has to. And Cesar turned back to his plate and ate in silence, with the quiet focus of a man already thinking about something the rest of the room isn't thinking about yet. Something he could see coming, the way people who grow up around power learn to see things coming. Not through prophecy, through pattern recognition, through understanding better than most that his father's certainty was not the same thing as his father's safety. He was right. He just couldn't stop it.